This video is matched with the 12th century Renaissance PowerPoint slideshow. So we have another Renaissance, and of course our definition of a Renaissance, the word means rebirth, is a rebirth of interest and focus on classical, which would be Greek and Roman culture and knowledge. And this one obviously takes place in the 12th century. And what triggers this Renaissance, rather than the earlier Carolingian attempt to be a Roman Empire, what we get here is a wave of new of Hellenistic knowledge coming into Europe that had not been there before. Much of it, as we'll see, coming through from the Arab world, and thus provoking a lot of excitement and interest in this Hellenistic knowledge, and triggering a lot of intellectual and cultural activity, and thus we have the 12th century Renaissance. So I'm going to go to the first slide, and that is Islamic influences. And as from the 11th century onwards, as Christians begin to reconquer, in the cases of Iberia, right, which is Spain, that had been conquered by the Arabs in 711, and beginning in about the 11th century, Christians from the north begin to reconquer Iberia, and they're taking over then cities and territory that were Islamic, and picking up on the Hellenistic knowledge that the Arabs had spread throughout their caliphate from their initial conquests. The same in Sicily, which had been conquered by Arabs, Saracens, right? And that's reconquered and is new. And then in the Crusades in the Holy Land, which take place mostly through the 12th century into the early 13th century, attempts to recapture Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the and restore them to Christian control. They are ultimately unsuccessful, but result in a lot prolonged period of contact between Christians and Muslims. And that's one thing that's of interest, is these places are often areas of war or confrontation, but after a territory has been taken over, then people find what's there and learn from them. And there is also always ongoing trade contacts and other things. So from these contacts, then there's this Hellenistic knowledge that the Arabs had adopted and learned from, as well as they're doing their own philosophy and culture and knowledge, including, as I've got on the slide, even the Persian poetry, which has influenced the Arab world heavily. These are now picked up by the Europeans. So previously, Hellenistic knowledge, remember, Hellenism never got to the West. So Hellenistic knowledge, especially Aristotle, Arab philosophers, Persian poetry, there's this amazing rush of knowledge and culture and information that the West is going to be very excited about as they make these contacts with the Arab world. So I'm going to go to the next slide. And the church, right, remember the church is really where knowledge is created and developed and learned, right? They're the people who read and write, whereas, only just now are the class of knights and nobles and so forth beginning to get more into literacy, the old. But so the church sets up, usually bishops from their cathedrals will set up schools, which are called universities. And these schools are where this Hellenistic and Arab knowledge comes in, translated, adopted, and new writings are created. And we have the creation of the university, the place where knowledge is created and disseminated. And that's the basically 12th century roots of the modern university. They started out as cathedral schools in the Catholic Church, and then have evolved over time. The scholars are members of the church, and they're the masters. They're the ones that I said create knowledge, and they also teach students. At first, students are other members of the church. Remember and so clergy and monks trying to get as we will see the push to educate better educated members of the church. But over time, you're going to get more sons of merchants, sons of knights coming in to get education, whether it be legal or just better educated to be a more productive member of society. They teach the 7 liberal arts, which are the 4 mathematical arts, the quadrivium, which are geometry, mathematics, astronomy, and music. If anybody knows music, it is very mathematical, if you know music notation, music theory. And then there's the trivium, which are the writing arts, which are grammar, and it's always Latin grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So the 7 liberal arts, those are the basic studies in a university, and then everything builds on those. And then the advanced arts are theology, medicine, and law. These are where you get your Master of Arts in, and those 3. Theology makes sense, right, for church-run schools, but also you have, as you can see, medicine and law become very popular. So we have a very widespread education, right, in both mathematical arts and in the writing arts, and science, what we now call science and humanities, would fall under those. And then you got the advanced studies. And so these universities prop up, in France to start with, and then you see them over the next few centuries, dozens and dozens of them emerging and growing throughout Europe. And I said at first educating members of the church, and then later on other people. So a very fundamental, important institution. Like I said, not just teaching the knowledge that they brought from the Hellenistic world, from the Arab world, but also creating new knowledge based on that. And we'll look at some of that briefly later. Let's go to the next slide. And now we have the basic curriculum. If you'll notice, you see I've got the quadrivium, the 4 mathematical arts, and the trivium, the 3 written arts. You'll notice that every single one of these is ancient Greek or ancient Roman, right? This is a Renaissance. We take the ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, use it as our basic fundamental to build on. Notice Boethius is in there. He did a wonderful music theory treatise, which is going to be used for a long time, as well as his Consolation of Philosophy. So he's quite influential in the Middle Ages. But Aristotle's logic is famous. Euclid, we've ran across him as one of the Alexandrian scholars, right, who created geometry, and other ones too. So basic, fundamental, you can call it Hellenistic knowledge, as the fundamental knowledge at the base of the 12th century Renaissance that they build from. In fact, if you look at the next slide, you go to the advanced curriculum, they'll build up, right, from the 7 liberal arts, and then the fundamental core of philosophy are Aristotle and Plato, of course. Then you've got ancient Greek and Roman scholars in medicine, law, theology. There's like 5 names there. There's Boethius with our Consolation of Philosophy, and other early church writers and thinkers. So again, it is essentially Roman Greek fundamentals for this Renaissance. So that's a pretty good curriculum. And then, right, as they teach this, and as more medieval thinkers add to this knowledge as they work with these basic fundamentals, and then add their own theology or add their own philosophy, they will be part of the curriculum too. What I wanted to give you is the fundamental basic Hellenistic and Roman knowledge that is part of the curriculum that they will then build on and add their own to. Okay. So next one is, as you can see from the map on the next one, which says universities, you can see the growth of universities as a small smattering of them in a few places. And then as you go through the Middle Ages, expanding all the way across Europe. I've listed some of the major universities on the slide. Paris is the most famous for theology. Montpellier, which is in France, is one of the best law schools in Europe. Oxford will become one of the ones for philosophy, especially natural philosophy, which is the foundation of science. Salerno in Sicily, one of the best medical schools in Europe, and Bologna in Italy, one of the best law schools in Europe. So, we think about that, don't we? What's a good medical school, or a good law school, or a good, school? And they're already doing that back in the Middle Ages. We can see these then dotted across Europe, disseminating and producing knowledge. So let's go to the next slide and talk about producing knowledge, right? And what I've got on this slide, it's called scholasticism. Scholasticism is the medieval work for the work of the scholars, right? So scholastics are scholars. So the medieval philosophy is sometimes, or medieval knowledge is sometimes called scholasticism, the work of the scholars. Now, you'll notice that it is based on Aristotle and Plato. At the bottom of the slide, I have Aristotle. Remember his realism? He just says, people define a chair because it's a thing that you sit on. Whereas Plato, who was an idealist, said there's such a thing as a perfect chair that we try to copy here, right? Realism versus idealism. And realism, Plato has been very, very influential in Christianity because, you can have idealism as God, what is in God's mind, what is God's concepts. And Neoplatonism then becomes Christian. In other words, it's Plato's idealism, but God is the ideals, and what God thinks and creates are the ideals. But Aristotle a lot of Aristotle's works have reached Europe in the 12th century, and we're adding a lot of realism to the idealism. His description of how things work and what they are is incredibly influential. Yes, that's why I'm in this room, sitting at the strange angle. We have a sick cat from our cat rescue that we volunteer for, and he's sort of in transit right now, and this cat's sort of wandering around the room, and I'm sort of watching him for a bit. So you'll hear things and see cat running. Right. The main thing that the medieval thinkers are looking at are issues of faith and reason, using both realistic and idealistic approaches. Because these are Christian scholars, but looking at Aristotle especially, the use of reason and logic to understand how the world works. How do you reconcile the two? What if Aristotle seems to contradict what the Bible says? And yet, this stuff is really important to know. So a lot of the work of the medieval scholars is trying to reconcile faith and reason. How does my faith work? How does reason work? And what can we know from each one? And two of the most important thinkers I've got there are Thomas Aquinas and William of Ockham. Both of them, like I said, masters at the universities. Aquinas is at Paris. William of Ockham is in Oxford, but he travels a bit. Thomas Aquinas and they have two different approaches. Thomas Aquinas tries to put the two together and says that they don't contradict, that I use my reason to better understand what I believe, to support my faith, and the two work together. There is no inherent contradiction. There are no separate truths. Reason supports faith with Aquinas. William of Ockham, who's a little bit later than Aquinas, does the opposite. He says the two are irreconcilable. If you try to use reason to understand God, you put God in a box that is limited by the reason of mankind. We cannot understand God. He is beyond our comprehension. That's why we have faith. Faith is one's belief in God. And so he says faith is for God, and one trusts in God's commands and God's law. Reason is for understanding the world around us. And in a way, what's going to happen here is, I think, Occam's philosophy that reason for understanding the world, faith for linking with God, has a similar line of separation as when we talked about with the separation of secular and sacred authority, right? The church is responsible for helping save souls. The king is responsible for ruling over our bodies. So you can almost see how faith and reason, faith, church, sacred authority, all right, the realm of faith, reason, logic, law, secular, right, the earthly, the worldly, separate spheres. There's pros and cons to both Aquinas's and Occam's approaches. With Occam, if you separate the secular and the sacred too much, then what morality may the secular have, and what basis in reality does the sacred have? So separating them, you can sometimes end up with each one sort of lacking something from the other. But with Aquinas, putting the two together, right, you've got morality and reason and faith and everything sort of supporting each other, but that sometimes means that you can restrict one or the other. Reason can restrict faith into something dry and technical. Faith might limit reason and say you can't do this because it contradicts faith. So both approaches have strengths and weaknesses, but these are what the medieval thinkers are trying to resolve. But the most key thing is they're not rejecting anything non-Christian if it's a really good idea. And that's sort of a key thing. So it's a fascinating sort of situation, setting us up for, again, the modern period. Next slide is advances. This, again, now we're moving forward. We've taken right, just like Aquinas and Occam are trying to work all this into a Christian viewpoint, right? We've taken all this knowledge, Aristotle, Plato, all these people, and saying, well, how does it work in the modern world? And remember, if you lived in the 12th century, that's the modern world, right? And you get people like in moral philosophy. You can almost divide philosophy into two. Moral philosophy is, right, the study of humans. You could call it the humanities. Whereas natural philosophy is the study of the world, the predecessor to the sciences. So John of Salisbury, and he writes a book about how do you have a political system work. And he comes up with this concept of the body politic. And it's going to be very popular as we go into the early modern period. But it's emerging in the 12th century. And he says, well, a kingdom works, the body is a good metaphor for how a kingdom works, right? The king is the head, the directing thing. The knights are the arms. They have the shield and sword, and they protect the body. The peasants are the legs and feet. They're growing the food is what supports the body, makes it stand. And then the merchants and craftsmen are the organs that move things around and make it work. And the concept of it, it's a metaphor, it's not literal. But the main concept he's saying is every part of society has a function, and a very essential and useful function, including peasants. And that's sort of an essential way of looking at a society. It's almost like early, very, very early sociology. How does a society work? What are the different elements, and what is their function, and how they interrelate? So it's kind of interesting. In natural philosophy, they're taking Aristotle's realism and sort of moving it forward. And it's in this medieval mindset, right, as we've talked about before, of using technology to solve problems rather than using slaves. And there's this idea that God also thinks that same way. How often do humans put God in their image, right? So that picture there of God with a measuring compass creating the universe is there thinking that God didn't just go poof, right? God calculated it, measured it, right? Created So if he calculated and measured a universe that follows laws, that we can measure that universe, understand those laws, which helps us understand God's creation and the purpose of God's creation and God better. But also, what's crucial for science is acknowledging that the universe runs under laws. This is a form of humanism, right? In that humans can use their reason. We've already talked about faith and reason. They're accepting reason is important. And humans can use their reason to understand how the universe works. So even with God as an omnipresent being, there are laws and rules that we can understand and understand the universe. One, a special group are the Oxford Calculators, a group of philosophers in Oxford University in the late 13th, 14th centuries who use mathematics. Some of it is mathematics they picked up from the Arabs. It's more advanced than the Greek mathematics. Use mathematics to try and understand basic physics and mechanics, velocity and mass and things like that. So mathematics as a tool beyond logic to sort of create the laws and rules of how the universe works. It's very basic, often wrong, but we're beginning the process of figuring out how to figure out rationally how the universe works. And it doesn't contradict Christianity because they're thinking God created a universe that follows by rules and doesn't just arbitrarily, right? Remember the old humanism, gods don't just make stuff happen, humans make things happen. In this case, the universe happens and God set it so. So very important developments in sort of looking at society and very, very important developments in thinking about understanding universal laws. Okay, next slide is technology. This takes us away from the universities, but I think it fits into what we're talking about in that, right, we're moving forward in not only knowledge, but in technology. And what a complete difference is to the Roman Empire, which basically took Greek knowledge and basically had their technology and it didn't change. And, it's taken a while as the early medieval ages is a period of chaos and change, but once we get set, this is a dynamic society, not only in adding to knowledge, but in adding to technology. Some of it is brought in from outside, but the Europeans are like, that's a cool technology, we're taking it, like gunpowder from China. Awesome, let's start making cannon. And by the end of the Middle Ages, they have good cannon. The spinning wheel for spinning a wool into thread is a mechanical wheel. A horizontal loom, which is pictured, is a way of having a large-scale machine, usually 2 people operated, for making large pieces of cloth. Again, you have foot pedals and hand things, and it's a pretty sophisticated machine for mass production of cloth. The clock, which actually there's a picture of one, the earliest clocks on the previous slide. They actually figure out how to make a clock, not one that's run by someone turning a wheel or water or sand or whatever, literally a clock that you wind up and it works. Portolan charts are navigational charts. There are sophisticated maps that show directions because they've picked up the compass from China. And so they know compass directions, and now you can make navigation charts using compass directions to sail rather than just sail, facing the sun for 3 days or something like that. And the Ars Nova, which are things like, we'll talk about Gothic art, which is sculpture and buildings. And polyphony is a sophisticated form of new music. The Ars Nova, the new arts. Why have I got them under technology? This is using sophisticated mathematical techniques and sophisticated building techniques in terms of Gothic buildings to build amazing technology to create more advanced music with better theoretical approaches. And it's dipped over in the slide, I almost missed it. Milling, of course, we've already seen that. Increased use of mills, which have mechanical clockwork systems. So technology. And what I'll do here is, we're up to 25 minutes, so I'll stop this and then we'll pick back up on a short video on the art and literature, which will be the next a couple of slides, but I'll just do a short one on that, so we don't have one really long video.